Hello everyone. This video is a step-by-step tutorial on how to build an editable grid-like experience in Power Apps. We will leverage the gallery control and use the new modern controls to create our grid experience. This grid will support full CRUD operations, undo, sort, filtering. It is fast, performant, and it can patch all the updates that are made in the grid in one go against your data source. So let's check it out in action. Let's begin with a blank Canvas app. I'll give this app a name. I'll pick the tablet form factor and click create. We need to first connect to our data source. The data source in this scenario that I will be selecting is a SharePoint list. However, the same concept will work with the Dataverse table, SQL, or any other data source of your choice. To connect to my SharePoint list, I'll go to Data, Add Data, search for the SharePoint connector. I can create a new connection or pick from my existing ones. Connect to my SharePoint site. I'll plug in the URL, click connect, and search for my SharePoint list called student tracker. Click connect, and the list is now connected in my Power App. Grid experience that we will create, we will build it entirely by using modern controls. And to enable them, I will head over to settings, go to upcoming features, and under preview, we have try out the modern controls. I've turned it on. And if I go to insert, right here, we have the modern controls to select from. We will leverage under layout a blank vertical gallery. For the data source property of this gallery, I will connect it to the student tracker list. And if I head over to edit gallery, this is where I can start inserting controls. Now my data source has a couple of text columns, title and last name. I will insert the text input modern control. And I'll insert a second one and place it right next to the first one. Then I have a choice column called subject and a lookup column called grade. And for both of these, I will leverage a drop-down control. Then I have a date column. So I'll pick the modern control date picker. And then finally, I have a yes/no column type in SharePoint. For that, I will insert the checkbox control. Now for the template item of the gallery, which is the first item in the gallery, if I select it, I can reduce the height of the template item. In this gallery, I have multiple rows. These are actually the rows of data coming in from my SharePoint list because the gallery items property is my SharePoint list. And this gallery has a template padding property. I'll change it to 0. And if I was to preview the app, and if I click on the first text box, you can see how the modern control highlights that I've selected that specific item. And the best part, I can even tab through the entire grid experience. My first control that I will rename txt first name. This control has a property called value. I will set it to this item, which is the current item of the gallery control, dot the title column from my SharePoint list. So this plugs in the first names from my SharePoint list. That's coming from the title column. Let's try the same for the last name control. Rename to txt last name, value, this item dot last name. Subject is a choice column. Here I have a drop-down control that I have renamed to DRP subject. There's a property called items. Here I will leverage the function choices, my data source, which is student tracker, dot the name of my column, which is subject. Now this returns a table that has a column called value. We go to the properties panel on the right. For fields, we click edit. We go to add field, select value and add. And here we can see the values for the subject drop-down control. Now this control has a default selected items property. I will leverage this item dot subject, and we can see all the subject values being populated. We have the lookup column called grade. For this drop-down controls items property, I'll use choices of my data source dot the name of my column, which is grade. Lookup columns look up to a different list in SharePoint. You can see the table has multiple columns, the ID of the item in the other list and its value. So in the properties panel on the right, we go to edit fields, go to add field, select the value, click add, and now we have the grade values loading in this drop down based on the lookup list. And for this control, default selected items will be this item dot grade. Then we have a date column for the date picker control. For the property value, we will leverage this item dot reported date. For my yes no type column, it's a checkbox control. It has a property called checked. This item dot the name of my column, and this checkbox control has a label property that I will change to active. Now this gallery works like an editable grid where the user can make changes to any of the values. I will leverage one collection and one variable. So for my gallery, if I go to edit gallery, I will insert a button. Now this button, I will place it on the right hand side. The button has a property called onSelect. Now this button is what we will click by calling the select property of the button whenever any of these control values are changed. I will use the function collect to collect data in a collection that I will call as call grid updates. And in this, I will first collect the entire item. So basically, I'm adding the current row into this collection. However, what if this row already exists? If is blank, lookup call grid updates, where ID, which is the unique identifier of every item in a SharePoint list, is equal to this item.id. In that case, go ahead and collect the current record in the collection. Let's format text. So we are checking to see if the current gallery row item ID, is it existing in that collection? If the response is blank, meaning it doesn't exist, in that case only, go and collect the current row information in the collection. To update the item that is in this collection with the latest values coming in from these controls, we will leverage a function called update if. So update my collection if the ID is equal to this item.id, and this will show all the columns in my SharePoint list. So let's begin with the title column. So I will use txt first name dot value, comma, last name. This will be txt last name dot value, comma, subject, my drop down control subject dot selected, comma, grade, drp grade dot selected, comma, reported date, date picker control dot value, and finally my column called active, my checkbox control dot checked. I will close the record. I'll close the update if function. I'll click format text, and this is what the formula looks like. I'll hold the control key and start selecting all of my controls. And all of these controls have a property called onChange. The select function, my button control is called button canvas 1. So I'll select this. I'll preview the app. For my first student Reza, I'll change the subject here to English. For James, I'll change the grade to B. So I made changes to 2 different rows. That means it would have clicked that button to add 2 rows in my collection. And on the left navigation, we have this new variable section. And if I go to collections, here is our collection called call grid updates. Let's go to view table, and we can see those 2 rows right here. I'll close this. And I can make multiple updates to those same rows. Even if I do that, I'm still modifying the same row. So we can see the collection still has 2 rows. But if I start modifying any other row, we can see the number of rows in the collection being updated. We head over to the visible property for this button control. I will set it to false, so the user does not even realize that that button is existing. In order for the user to save the changes, I will insert a button control. The text for this button, I will call it save. You can even add emojis. The type for this button, I'll set as primary. On select of this button, patch to my data source, which is student tracker, comma, the name of my collection. Now this collection includes details about all the columns in my SharePoint list. And there are certain columns that are of type read only. So what we need to do here to ensure that it successfully updates in one go, I will use the function show columns on my collection of grid data. And here I'll start providing the names of those columns. My columns are title, last name, subject, grade, reported date, and active. And one more column that I need to ensure that I add here is the ID column. This column will help the patch function identify which item it is trying to update in my SharePoint list, because ID is that unique column. I'll click format text. Next, I will use the notify function to give the user a notification message. Notification type success, and I will show this for 3 seconds. I need to ensure that I clear my collection because the grid updates collection has been patched to my data source. So if I preview the app, I had made some changes. Let's click save. It says the grid updates have been saved successfully. If I go back to the SharePoint list, I can see those changes. However, my gallery is not showcasing the latest updates. That's because I need the gallery to kind of reset. And to do that, when I'm performing save, right at the end here, I will create a variable called var_reset. I'll set it to false. And right in the next step, I will set it to true. Basically, I'm changing the state of a variable. And this variable is what I will use to filter the items property of the gallery. I'll simply use that variable. Now you can see that the grid is showcasing the correct values from my data source. Let's try making changes again. I'll change the grades to A for the first two. I'll change the dates to 28th for the next two. I'll click save. Save is performed. The values are reflected here in the grid as well as in my data source. Now to this grid, we'll add column headers. I'll go to insert. I'll first add a badge control. This, I will position it at the top. And I'll change its appearance to tint. And then I'll start adding text controls. The text property for this control, I'll call it first name. In the modern controls, we also have an info button control. I'll give the content student first name. So when the user selects this, it will show the information. Undo the changes. I will insert another button. The text for this, I'll use an emoji. I'll select this one. And when the user clicks this, clear my collection, which is called grid updates. And since I want the gallery to reset, I will set that variable of mine to false and then set that same variable to true. So here, as I make changes, if I select this button, it will reset all the changes. So for this button's display mode property, if count rows of my collection is equal to 0, meaning no changes were made on the grid, then you set the display mode of this button to disabled, else you set the display mode of this button to edit. So we can see how it's disabled. The moment I make some changes, it comes alive. If I reset, it will undo the changes. Let's try create. For that, I will insert a button, call this new. On select of this, I will leverage patch to directly add a record to my data source called student tracker. To create a new record, we have a function called defaults. So this will use the default values for a new row. Plus, I also have the option to set some values in that newly created row. For example, for my title column, which is mandatory, I'll just put a text called new student. And I'll go ahead, close this function. Once again, I want the gallery to reset. So if I preview the app, click new, notice I get an error that says one of my fields is required. So any required fields, I have to make sure there is some value associated with it. So my last name is a required field. So in this case, I'll pick last name. I'll give it a string which has a blank space. So now if I click new, it created a new record in my data source. Now that record is sitting right at the bottom. For the gallery controls items property, I will leverage the function sort to sort the results based on the modified column, and this I will sort in descending order. So my new student showing up right here at the top. Of course, I can make changes to this. Click save. The changes are made. If I click new, it will keep adding those new rows. Now, once I start making updates to the grid, if I now click new, it will add a new row and reset the gallery So I will lose the updates that were made. So what I need to ensure is, for the new button, I will set its display mode property to if count rows of my collection. If that is 0, in that case, I'll set this button to edit, else I will set this button to disabled. So notice I had made a couple of updates. So I cannot create another item. I have to either save this or reset this. Now I'm free to create more new rows. For deleting, I will select my gallery, go to edit, insert, the trash icon. I'll place this on the right hand side. On select of this, I will remove from my data source this item, and I need to reset my gallery. So I've gone ahead and set my variable to false and then true. This button, its visible property, I will show it only if count rows of my collection is equal to 0. I can delete the data. And if I make some changes, notice the delete option goes away because now I am technically editing data. And since this entire gallery is connected directly to our data source, we can also add filters to our gallery. And I'll add a drop down here. The items for this will be choices of my data source dot my column subject, go to fields, add value. So we have the subject options here to select from. Now if this reset is clicked, I will use reset on this specific drop down control. So this will go back to empty, and then I can pick any of these options. When I'm filtering based on that reset variable, I'll add an AND condition. Is blank, that filter drop down dot selected dot value, or my choice column in SharePoint called subject dot value is equal to that filter drop down control dot selected dot value. Subject is blank, shows me everything. If I change it to maths, it will only show me the values for maths. Geography, English. And when I click save, I'll also ensure that I reset that drop down control. So right now it's filtered based on maths. I'll change a few here to English. If I click save, all the changes are saved against my data source. If I check English, you can see the rows have increased. And you can make changes to the logic of this grid based on your scenario. For example, if I was to pick English and add a new row, I would like that row to default the value English. So when I was creating the new row, my subject will be the value from this dropdown. And once again, if I make changes and save, it will save. If you enjoyed this video, then do like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And thank you so much for watching.